everybody. Welcome to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I'm Professor Jay Bhattacharya, and I'm delighted to have with me my good friend, Dr. Martin Kulldorff, joining me from Connecticut. Martin, I've been wanting to have you on a podcast where I get to ask the questions for once for a long time, and thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Jay. It's a great pleasure.
So those who don't know, Martin and I have got to be good friends throughout the pandemic. We have written countless articles together. I lost track, Martin. I don't know if you kept track of how many articles we've written together, how many podcasts we've talked on, news appearances.
Sometimes, I think.
And I think we try to put them together. I mean, it runs into the thousands of pages. Anyways, Martin, it has been a goal of mine to get to talk with you in public so that people can see some more about your life. And you just wrote a really interesting, important piece about what happened to you during the pandemic, and in particular how Harvard, the place where I used to work and where you were a professor for decades, treated you. And I want to get to that story. In fact, that is the occasion for this podcast.
Yeah, it was published in City Journal earlier today.
Now, I think what I would like to do before we get to that piece, though, is I want to introduce the audience, most who probably know you, but many who may not, to something about your background and how you got involved in the pandemic. So why don't we start before the pandemic, Martin? You're a statistician. You're an epidemiologist. What sorts of work did you do before the pandemic? What are the most important things that we should know about your work before the pandemic?
Well, before that, I was born and raised in Sweden, which is why I have a strange accent. My first encounter with the U.S. was when I was 8 years old. My parents took me to Texas in the middle of October. And 2 weeks after we arrived, my mother told me to put on a costume and go and knock on people's doors. And where we knocked on the doors, they gave us candy. So I've been in love with the U.S. ever since. And I went then back to Sweden, but for graduate school, I came back to the U.S. So I took my PhD at Cornell University. And eventually I worked at the National Cancer Institute at University of Connecticut and then at Harvard's medical school. And I developed new statistical and clinical methods for disease surveillance. And one aspect is the early detection and monitoring of disease outbreaks. Another one is the monitoring of vaccine and drug safety after they have been approved by the FDA. So those were my two major areas of research. So I helped develop the systems that is used by CDC and FDA and many of the state and local health departments to do outbreak detection and disease surveillance.
So you had a piece of software, something called StatScan, that tracks disease outbreaks in physical space. And I remember reading at one point, even before I knew you, Martin, about the 2015 Legionnaire's disease outbreak in New York City. Your software was used to track down and limit the spread of that disease and control it, so it didn't become a major outbreak that it might have been otherwise.
Yeah, so it was a major outbreak. It was the second biggest Legionnaire's disease outbreak in the nation ever. But when you have an outbreak like that, even detecting it 1 day earlier or 2 days earlier can mean that you save people's lives, because in this case, there was contaminated water towers in Bronx. So unfortunately, quite a few people died. But the sooner you detect those things, the sooner you can figure out what's causing it, and the sooner you can sort of mitigate it and take it away. So whether it's Legionnaire's disease or Salmonella or something else, a job of public health departments is to monitor each state has about 70 reportable diseases that has to be reported, and you then monitor them to see if there's an outbreak that you have to deal with in some ways. And then after the outbreak has been detected, you also want to monitor if it sort of moves to a different part of the city or state.
And you actually had a Twitter presence before the pandemic in order to support the software. So the State Department, the public health departments are using it. It was like a technical. How many followers did you have back then?
I think he had about 400 followers, and it was basically about twice a year I would post something saying that we have a new version of the software come out, or somebody will write, maybe somebody from a state health department will write a really cool article using it, explain how they did it, and I will sort of post that so that other people could see the good work that they were doing.
Martin, so we were talking about the CDC and the FDA. You worked with the CDC and the FDA on vaccine safety for a long time. What did you do with them? What did you actually did your work result in changes in how vaccines were deployed in the United States?
Yeah, so I work with monitoring the safety of drugs and vaccines after they've been approved, so post-market surveillance. And with CDC, for a couple of decades, I worked with the Vaccine Safety Data Link, which is a joint project I have with health brands to get electronic health records. So whenever some child gets a vaccine, we know exactly what date. And then if they have let's say a seizure, we know exactly how many days later they have the seizure. So we can find out if there's an excess risk for seizures or something else after the vaccinations. And we set up a system where we will get weekly data, so we can monitor it almost continuously. So if there's a problem, we can find out as soon as possible. And if there's not, we can be reassured that the vaccine is safe. And for most of the vaccines we monitored, they were fine. We might find some simple adverse reactions like fever or a little rash at the injection site, but for most of them, they were fine. But one problem we detected was for the measles, mumps, rubella, varicella vaccine that Merck put out, which is 4 diseases in one needle. And that was supposed to replace the measles, mumps, rubella and the varicella, 2 separate vaccines. But it turned out that there was an excess risk of febrile seizures 7 to 10 days after the vaccines. So that led them to a change in policy where instead of not recommending this MMRV vaccine for 1-year-old children, but instead giving them separate two shots to minimize the risk for febrile seizures. For 5-year-olds, the MMRV vaccine is fine. It doesn't cause seizures, but for the 1-year-olds, it did.
I have to say, Martin, that before we met, I had used some of the statistical methods you developed, because it's a difficult problem you're talking about. You have lots of things that happen after someone gets vaccinated. How do you tell that it is actually a result of the vaccine or not just some random event that sometimes happens? Statistically is a challenging question, and sometimes you get events. A few stray events that really are just statistical noise, or you want to be able to pick something up early and act on it before it is broadly used in the population. So, vital part of the vaccine safety infrastructure, so that people can be assured that the vaccines that are on the market are not causing serious adverse events, in any significant number. And I've used your results and your statistical methods in my own work before that. So Martin, I kind of knew you before the pandemic, even though we never met. But the point is, I want to make, you've been working for decades in public health. The methods that you'd used, developed, had been widely used in standard public health settings. I know you had a long relationship, for instance, with a number of state public health agencies as well as the CDC. In no way were you a fringe epidemiologist before the pandemic, right?
Well, I try to do my best helping develop public health practice, and I enjoy the work. I think it had some impact. I think health is important for everybody. So if we can, and public health is very important. Public health is different from clinical medicine, because clinical medicine, you focus on treating a particular disease in a particular patient. But in public health, you have to look not just at one disease, you have to look at all diseases. You can't just look at now, you have to look at the future also. And you can't just look at one patient or those who are most privileged in society. You have to also look at the health of everybody, including the poor, the middle class, and all ages, and so on. So, public health is supposed to be very holistic, overall, encompassing philosophy, but I think that was lost during the pandemic, unfortunately.
I mean, I think that the point is that you were steeped in public health. You were not anti-public health. You were not anti-vaccine. You were steeped in public health. You developed statistical and analytical methods that were used very widely in public health for vital public health functions. And the work that you did saved lives. You're not going to answer that, I know, because you're too modest, but that is absolutely true. Before the pandemic, the work that you did has directly saved lives, both by tracking the spread of a disease in a space like we describe as Legionnaire's disease, and also by identifying vaccine side effects before the vaccine had been used very, very broadly, very early on, with sophisticated statistical methods.
Yeah, being interested in adverse reactions to vaccine is not anti-vaccine. That's a pro-vaccine position, because if there is a bad vaccine, we want to not use it and maybe develop something better later on. And if it's a good vaccine, we want to make sure that we know that it's a good vaccine. So I think looking very seriously and thoroughly at vaccine adverse reactions or drug adverse reactions is not an anti-vaccine position; it's a pro-vaccine position.
Okay, so now that folks understand, I think this is something I hadn't seen you talk about so much with people, but I wanted to make sure that people heard your background, just to understand why you were a professor at Harvard. Like, you had accomplished a tremendous amount in public health. 2020 arrives. There's a new virus floating around. When did you first hear about it, and what were your first thoughts? What work did you do early in the pandemic, Martin?
Well, I first sort of came to my when COVID reached northern Italy and Iran, which was the two areas that was first hit outside of China, I immediately knew as an infectious disease immunologist that this would reach the whole world, and there was no way to avoid it, because it didn't come to Italy like with one known person very openly. It could have came. We don't know who brought it, and it had already been spreading for a while before it was noticed. So that makes it impossible to sort of stop it, just like the flu. If we have one case of Ebola or a couple of cases, then one can sort of, those are easy to detect and we can sort of stop it. But if that comes to the US, for example, but something that comes sort of under the radar like this can never be stopped. So it was obvious to me that it would reach the US eventually. It would reach my family eventually. So I was maybe afraid for about 10, 20 minutes. Because I'm a single father, I have 3 children. As every parent, I'm more concerned about my kids than myself. So I looked at the data from Wuhan, and this was early 2020, and I looked at the mortality and the ages of the people. And I could see that most people who died were older people. And there were very few, much less middle-aged, and I think there was no children. So while at that time we didn't know exactly how dangerous it was, we didn't know the infection fatality rate, but it was clear, I did some back of the envelope calculations, it was clear that there was at least 1,000-fold difference in mortality risk between the old and the young. And that turned out to be true once we had more reliable data. So, but that was also just clear from the first mortality reports from Wuhan from a few dozen cases. So then I figured, okay, my kids are going to be fine here. They're not going to die from this. And some older people will for sure die, and that's tragic, and we should try to limit that as much as we can. But I was no longer afraid of my kids. So when it was time to come to Sweden, or to the US, my kids will be fine in Sweden, my nieces will be fine, and so on.
And now, did you try to get these results? You said call them back of the envelope calculations, but that seems like a very, very important result to have available to you in like late January, early February 2020. Should be like a primary guide to policy is who's at risk. And you had that result very early.
Yeah, so at that time it wasn't talked about, and I tried to publish it, but it was not possible in the US. I tried both scientific as well as mainstream media outlets. And it was kind of a shock that they would do general lockdowns because they didn't make any sense. It didn't make any sense to close the schools. What made sense was to do as much as possible to protect older people while letting kids live their lives so that we don't harm them by closing schools, for example, and let young people also to live their lives, students and young adults, and have the young people do the work that needed to be done to keep society afloat so that the older people could sort of take a step back and be protected. So it was a shock that the US went full lockdown mode. And at one point, the UK was actually saying that, well, we will eventually do things, but for now, just be calm. And then overnight, they shift course and also went full lockdown. And this went against all the basic principles of public health. We can't just worry about COVID. We have to worry about other aspects of health, cancer, cardiovascular disease, mental health, education for kids. And we know, there were less cancer screenings, there were less cancer treatment. People didn't go to the hospitals if they have cardiovascular disease problems, so many died at home. Mental problems went up the roof. So this had dire consequences on other aspects of public health. And in public health, you can't just focus on one disease. You have to focus on public health at large. And also the lockdowns, it has some effects because it circulates when people meet each other. So if people meet each other less, there will be some effect, but that just pushes the problem into the future. And it just prolongs the pandemic, making it harder for older people to protect themselves because they have to protect themselves for a longer time period. So I think it was a disaster. It was obvious very early on that this was a disaster that the US were heading towards. And therefore I tried to publish it, but I was unable to. Eventually I posted it on my LinkedIn account. I was able to publish in Sweden, in my native Sweden, where I published in the two major daily newspapers, and basically supporting the Swedish strategy because Sweden did not do the lockdown. They kept schools open for everybody between ages 1 and 15. And Sweden was heavily criticized for not locking down like other countries. So I was hoping, well, if I can sort of write in Sweden and support was Anders Tegnell and Johan Giesecke was doing, then if Sweden can just hold on until the summer, then everybody will realize that the right thing is to keep the schools open and so on.
So Martin, what you just described, with the thought pattern that you had in February 2020 sounds very much like the Great Barrington Declaration that we worked on in October 2020.
For sure, yeah. That was the same thing. And you had voiced similar things. Sunetra Gupta at Oxford voiced similar things. I remember early on I watched an interview that she had with a journalist from India with a lot of clarity. Sunetra is Dr. Gupta, she's the preeminent infectious disease epidemiologist in the world. Scott Atlas was saying similar things, and of course the people in Sweden. So, and there were others, various people. So, and some of them I didn't learn about later because it wasn't sort of, everybody had a hard time making their voice heard. So I guess a lot of us felt like a lone voice, but we were not really. There were a lot of people who tried to speak up in vain.
At my university, there was John Ioannidis, for Scott Atlas, and I got to be good friends. I think a lot of people, a lot of very prominent people, were thinking along these patterns in February 2020, and were also shocked. I, as like you, was incredibly shocked by the lockdowns that came in March of 2020. I didn't realize that they were even possible to be imposed. And like you, among my very first thoughts were to the harm that they were going to do to children. closing schools has tremendous negative effects on children. Just to pick one small, not really small one, but an important one, is child abuse. Child abuse is often identified at schools, and you close schools, the child abuse doesn't go away; it just doesn't get identified and dealt with. There's of course learning loss. You mentioned the harm to people who with heart disease, with cancer, that end up with essentially dying from things that are preventable because they can't see doctors. All those thoughts went through my head too. It was the idea of the Great Barrington Declaration, I think, was in the minds of many, many, many people.
Yeah, we know now that we know from studies from the U.S. that from test results from the schools that the test results went down, and that's not a surprise because if they didn't, then what's the purpose with schools? So obviously they're going to go down, and this will be a long way. I think we will never recover fully. So those kids will have been harmed for life. They will not have the same education that they should have had.
So Martin, I have to say, so at this point, I was very frustrated, and like you, I felt I was a little lucky because I had Scott Atlas here and John Ioannidis and a few other folks at Stanford that I could talk with, but largely I felt isolated because so many of my Stanford colleagues were on the other side of the lockdown debate, I'd never been on Twitter before, and I still. At that point, I had been telling my graduate students not to join Twitter, just to write scientific papers. That's how you change the world. But I went to Twitter, Martin, I confess, and I immediately found you. And I saw almost every time there's somebody who is supporting the lockdown, you would reply with a link to data from Sweden showing that the school closures were not necessary, that they were not necessary to protect teachers, and that children were at very, very low risk of dying from COVID itself.
Yeah, so there were 1.8 million kids in Sweden between ages 1 to 15 who went to school all that spring semester of 2020. So the Public Health Agency of Sweden, they put out this study in, I think, end of June, early July, where they showed that of these 1.8 million kids who were in school, there were no masks, they were and out of those, exactly 0 died from COVID. And there were a few hospitalizations. So it was clear that these kids were not at risk. And they also looked at teachers who had the same risk as the average of other professions. So it wasn't dangerous for teachers either. So I figured, well, this is important information, but it wasn't discussed in the US. And I didn't have any other venue to get out except Twitter. So therefore, as soon as somebody posted something, I would sort of respond with a link. And it was very strange also because New England Journal of Medicine was supposed to be a good medical journal. It's edited by Harvard faculty. They put out a piece in the end of July or mid-July about whether schools should open or not. And they didn't even mention Sweden. And everybody knew that Sweden had been kept the schools open. So that's like looking at a new drug and not comparing it with a placebo.
That was written by some of your Harvard colleagues, right? If I recall.
Yeah, 2 Harvard colleagues and then one other person, I think, from a different university. So I was sort of frustrated that not being able to get up with this study. So I tried through Twitter, and most of the times nothing happened. But a few times somebody saw it, and with somebody who had more than a few hundred followers, and they would retweet it. So slowly, some people learned about this study. I also, finally, in August, I managed to get in a piece about Sweden's keeping the schools open in CNN, in CNN Espanol, because I know how to write in Spanish. I figured, okay, if I can't publish in English, why don't I try Spanish? So they were very nice. They published it. And but CNN English didn't want it.
So the Swedes got to hear your wisdom. The CNN Espanol, that's mainly Mexico, I imagine.
It's a lot of US also, actually. Look, because US has a lot of Spanish-speaking people. So the Spanish-speaking population of US would have had a chance to read it.
Okay, but not English speaking people who didn't get to read it unless they had Google Translate and knew to use it.
Yeah.
You were on you were on Twitter at this time. Your follower count was increasing. I imagine quite a lot. There must have been a fair bit of attention to you. But I'll tell you one thing I found, Martin. When Elon eventually bought Twitter a few years afterwards, and it turned out that I was on a government blacklist that reduced the spread of my own tweets. We'll tell the story how I got onto Twitter. You're actually to blame for this, Martin, as you know, in part. But that comes later. When I went to Twitter headquarters, I asked to see whether your account had been placed on a blacklist, and it turned out that during that summer of 2020, when you were posting all these links to Swedish data documenting the safety of opening schools, Twitter had also placed you on a blacklist.
Yeah.
I mean, so it was very difficult to get the word out. It looked like that we were isolated and alone in our ideas and opinions and the evidence that we're pointing to. But I don't think that we actually were, Martin, at this point. I think that there were actually many people, maybe even the majority of epidemiologists at the time, who were uncomfortable with the lockdowns and the school closures.
Well, among my own colleagues who I sort of know on a personal basis, when I discuss this on a personal basis, I would say the majority agreed with us about the pandemic, and that lockdowns were not wise, and we should have done a better job protecting the elderly. So there was never a consensus for the Fauci lockdowns. No.
Now, at that point, you were posting, and your public profile started to grow, and it was really very clear that you were opposed to the lockdown strategy. Was Harvard treating you okay at that time in July 2020?
I don't think they were aware of my Twitter post, to be honest. They were not so widely read. So,
but were there any efforts to try to organize public debates on campus because obviously those other Harvard professors that wrote that New England Journal piece had a very different perspective than you did. Were there any public fora on campus where the people tried to organize it? It seems like a major university ought to be organizing those kinds of debates and discussions on a topic so important as this.
There were public meetings about the pandemic, but they were not debates or discussions. Later on, in October or November of 2020, there were attempts by two of my colleagues to arrange a debate, but there were no takers on the other side. There was a debate between me and some other Harvard faculty who were sort of in favor of lockdowns and school closures, but there were no takers on the other side.
Okay, so it's now time to tell the story how we actually met, Martin. And I'm sure you remember, I will, for the rest of my life, never forget where we met for the first time in person physically. It was at the steps of the Oval Office, right before we walked in to speak with the President of the United States.
Yes, great place to meet.
So there's a backstory to that. The backstory is that our common friend, Scott Atlas, had been selected by the President of the United States, President Trump, to be his COVID advisor. Scott was quite frustrated that he was unable to convince or even really engage with Deborah Birx and Tony Fauci on the scientific basis for not putting lockdowns in place, the scientific basis for focused protection, the scientific basis for keeping the schools open. And his plan was to try to get a group of experts in front of the president. He called me and said, Jay, do you know any experts? He and I had become friends by this time. I think in July 2020, he called me and said, Jay, do you know any people who that the president ought to meet? And I immediately thought of you, Martin, thanks to Twitter. So despite the blacklist, it didn't work. I had learned about you at least. That led then, I think, Scott called you? How did that happen? He must have called you out of the blue.
Yes, so I never met Scott before either, but we talked on the phone a few times before the meeting at the White House. I think he felt very lonely in the White House. He clearly was very much following the basic principles of public health, and he wanted to know exactly what was going on with this virus and what are the best ways to do it. And I think he had his ideas were right on the money. But sometimes he wanted to discuss like a scientific paper that came out and get a different or a complementary perspective on it. So he would sometimes call and discuss some paper because he was really into the science of this, which I think he was frustrated that Anthony Fauci and Deborah Birx sort of ignored the scientific facts that was coming out there.
Hi, everyone. A quick word from our first and exciting sponsor, Alchemy Elements. Alchemy Elements is a powerful adaptogenic supplement. For those of you who don't know, adaptogens are a class of plant compounds, primarily herbs and mushrooms, which can help build the mind and body's resistance to stress. Alchemy Elements contains a very unique and carefully selected blend of 9 adaptogens, such as lion's mane, cordyceps, polygalaroot, and shilajit, and they can help boost energy, boost your immunity, and increase focus and overall stabilize your mood. It can have a wide array of effects, which can often depend from individual to individual, but it's a great way to start your morning and generally increase your focus and your energy levels. You can just pour 1 scoop of Alchemy Elements into your morning coffee or your protein shake or smoothie, and you're off to the races. It's a great way to start the day. I use it every day. I find that it can generally stabilize my mood levels and increase focus, especially if I want to get a big project done or finish a very important task. Alchemy Elements often is a great way to kind of start and get my focus going and get me primed for whatever task I want to accomplish. We're very excited and very happy to work with Alchemy Elements. We've been working with them for a couple of months, and now in this new iteration of the podcast, we're going to continue our relationship, which is very special to us because Alchemy aligns with our mission and values of individuals taking greater ownership of their personal, mental, and physical health and relying less and less on corrupt and flawed, generalized kind of medical advice. And less reliance on pharmaceutical drugs, and more of a general interest and focus on holistic health. For a limited time, Illusion of Consensus readers and listeners can get 10% off their first order using the code word Illusion, or 30% off a subscription monthly order, where you can get a monthly shipment of Alchemy Elements delivered to you. For these subscription orders, you can also get with it a bonus gold kit to store your Alchemy Elements. Overall, I think Alchemy is a fantastic product. I highly recommend you check them out in the link below in this podcast, wherever you're listening, Spotify, Apple, Substack, Rumble, or YouTube. Just go to the link, use the code word Illusion, and you can get your discount, and you won't regret it.
I mean, that was my experience with Scott, too. We discussed paper after paper after paper. Of course, for scientists, it was a very exciting time. How many times in the life of an epidemiologist do you have a new disease of note that you get to track and learn about? I mean, it's a sad thing for many people, but it's also for scientists, it's an opportunity to learn and use the scientific method for the public good. And I think that's how Scott was thinking about this at the time.
I mean, sure, from a scientific perspective, infectious diseases are fascinating.
Yeah.
They can be deadly, so in that sense, they're pretty awful. But in terms of how they spread, it's very interesting conceptually, and so how that operates.
But for Scott, I think for me and you, I know for both of us that it wasn't just a theoretical exercise. The reason to read these scientific papers was to make better decisions about how to protect human life.
Exactly. So it was very, very important. And of course, as a scientist, then you try to help as in any way you can. So if Scott called, of course, I will spend all the time necessary to help him in a way possible.
All right, so we end up in the Oval Office. I remember that. I will never, to the end of my life, forget that. We were supposed to spend 5 minutes there with President Trump. but he kept asking us questions. What did he ask you, Martin? What did you tell him?
So he has very good questions. We talked about testing, for example, and that it's important to do testing in nursing homes of not just the patients, but the caretakers, the staff, to avoid, to minimize the risk of the infection coming into nursing homes. At the same time, it's useless to test students in universities. So it was a very good conversation. I guess the one I remember the best is the one where I contradicted the president. He asked, well, I didn't really contradict, but he asked me, so I heard that Sweden is doing really poorly, because that's what people have been telling him. So I had to say, no, Sweden is actually doing very well. They're not locking down. And in terms of the COVID, they're doing very well. Kids, the schools are open and the kids are doing great. So I think the president found it interesting to get a perspective that was different from what he sort of heard through the official channels or the
Yeah, I mean, like the testing is a really interesting point. The argument for testing in nursing homes is to minimize the risk to use testing to minimize the risk of a vulnerable person, a vulnerable older person coming in contact with someone who might be positive with the disease. The reason not to test university students is that they're very, very low risk, and so quarantining them to reduce the spread of it actually ends up potentially harming them, because the quarantine itself is harmful to the students.
Yes.
You know, Martin, one of the incidents I remember really vividly right around this time was that about 100 of my Stanford colleagues, including the former dean of the university, the medical school at Stanford, organized a letter attacking Scott for his COVID stances. And they essentially accused him very scurrilously of pseudoscience. I mean, he was advocating, as you said, for focused protection, better protection of vulnerable older people, advocating for open schools. This, to me, was a mainstream position among infectious disease epidemiologists, among epidemiologists, and Scott was advocating for it. 100 of my colleagues signed a letter. Essentially, I mean, one of the major points was they implied that he was against hand washing. And for me, it was really tough. I wasn't on Twitter, so it felt like I didn't have a voice. I'd been at that time. The Stanford I'd been under this cloud of an investigation for reasons I can talk about later, and I just come through that, and Stanford had cleared me, and it was a difficult time for me to say, okay, I want to get involved in this debate, but I desperately wanted to. I wanted to see some way to organize a debate at Stanford. But one of the things I noticed was there was a letter from you defending Scott in the Stanford Daily, and you asked any of those 100 people that had signed that letter against Scott to a debate. Did you hear from any of them?
No, I did not. It was a very strange letter, because you're right. They were accusing him of pseudoscience, even though he was following the basic principles of public health. And the other strange thing was that they didn't give a single concrete examples of where he was wrong. They did mention, but we believe in this and this, and we think we should do hand washing. As you said, trying to imply that Scott was against hand washing, and of course, every public health person knows that it's good to wash your hands, and even more so when there are infections going around. So it was very strange, and I just wanted to give examples that he is not alone in this. I have the same views as Scott. I mentioned Dr. Snehta Gupta at Oxford and suggested that people should read some of her writing on the pandemic. And then I offered to debate any of them, but nobody has taken up my offer, and I'm still happy to do it if any of them would like to do it. And I think that if a scientist refuses to debate other scientists, even if it's a Stanford scientist or Harvard scientist, you shouldn't believe them. You shouldn't trust them at all if they refuse to debate other scientists, because it means that they don't have their arguments.
just a little bit after that, a few months after that, the former president of Stanford University, not the president during the pandemic, the former president in the late teens, Stanford in the 20 teens, he reached out to me. A man named John Hennessy reached out to me and tried to organize a debate at Stanford, which I readily agreed to, but he couldn't find anybody among the people who signed that letter. It was actually a big disappointment to me because I've been at Stanford for so long. I thought that Stanford was a place that would embrace those debates. And when you sent that letter, Martin, I had in my mind that Harvard was a better place to be than Stanford, because there's at least one Harvard professor that is willing to put up a debate. In fact, I think this may be a point of contention between me and you about which place was worse, Stanford or Harvard during the pandemic.
Well, Stanford had great people during the pandemic. 3 examples are yourself and Scott Atlas and Johnny Anidis. Yeah.
Anyway,
Stanford should be proud of the 3 of you, and as well as others who voiced things. So.
Well, I have to say, when I saw that letter from you, I was so proud of you, and I was actually very hopeful that someone that when people that signed that letter, at least one of them people who signed that letter, would feel that the obligation to defend their thinking when a prominent professor from Harvard comes back and says, "Look, I'm willing to discuss this with you. I'm willing to debate this with you."
And Stanford Daily is the student-run newspaper at Stanford. So
Yes.
I very much appreciate that they were willing to publish my letter. So that honors them that they did that.
Okay, so you did have a couple of debates, though. You had a few debates around this era with people like Rochelle Walensky, who then would go on to become the head of the CDC.
I wouldn't call it a debate, but there was a one-directional interaction. So I was interviewed by the public radio station in Boston soon after the Great Barrington Declaration, about the declaration. And after they interviewed me, they had her come on. She was a board member of the Brigham Women Hospitals where I worked. So she came on as an official representative. She's and as all faculty members at the hospital, she's a member of the professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School. So she came on sort of to give an official rebuke to me, but she could sort of respond to what I had said, but I could not respond to what she had said. So there wasn't a debate or discussion. It was sort of a one-directional affair.
Yeah. I mean, I listened to that. It sounded to me a little more like a smear job than an honest engagement. And of course, she went on to sign a document called the John Snow Memorandum, criticizing the Great Barrington Declaration in ways that actually turned out to be just wrong scientifically. It was premised on the idea that the lockdown harms weren't that big, were in a sense unavoidable, that there was no immunity after COVID recovery, or that it's possible there was little evidence of immunity after COVID recovery, and that a vaccine was coming for certain, and that it was wise to lock down. I mean, I think in many of those points that were not supported by the scientific, especially about immunity, were not supported by the scientific literature. So I'm not surprised that she didn't really directly engage with you, Martin.
Yeah, I mean, she wasn't smearing me or anything. She was very polite, and of course said her views, which was different from my views and the Great Barrington Declaration. But that thing so she was one of the signers of the memorandum that were published by The Lancet, which used to be one of the sort of more prestigious medical journals, where they question national immunity, which we have known about since 430 BC during the Athenian plague. So. And she wasn't the only Harvard faculty members. There was, I think, 2 other signers. So that was very, very strange that you have high-level scientists who are questioning infection-acquired immunity. So that's like having people in physics question whether the Earth is flat or round. These are sort of the basic facts that we've known about for so long.
You did have a couple of debates, though, Martin. I mean, there were at least a few scientists who were willing to discuss with you publicly. But a man named Paul Offit, I think you had a debate. And then there was also Andrew Neumer. I think you had a constructive debate with.
Yeah, so I admire that they were willing to do a debate. With Andrew Neumer, I think it was about lockdowns. With Paul Offit, I was arguing against vaccine mandate. He was arguing in favor of vaccine mandates. And my argument was that, one of my arguments was that vaccine mandates doesn't make sense, because if somebody have had COVID, why mandate vaccines? Because they already have superior immunity from having had COVID. And if the vaccine is good, you shouldn't waste it on people who don't need it. You should use it on older people who haven't had COVID, who really need it. So to me, vaccine mandate is it's unscientific, it's unethical, and it's actually anti-vaccine. If you believe that these vaccines work, you should argue against vaccine mandates so that people who actually need them can get them, rather than people who had already had COVID. I mean, he couldn't really argue against vaccine-acquired immunity, so I think he tried to bring up the issue of freedom of sort of those legal principles, which I think everybody should be free to do what they want. But that wasn't really. I tried to argue it from the public health perspective, but he wanted to argue it. But he wanted to argue, I think, public health or saving lives versus sort of freedom. And I don't think there was never a contradiction between the two.
It was interesting. I remember listening to that debate. It struck me that he thought that it was bureaucratically too difficult to take account of natural immunity or immunity after COVID recovery. And then that was a reason to require the vaccine, even though there was clear that the marginal benefit for anyone who already had COVID and recovered was very, very low.
I don't think he mentioned that during the debate. I could be wrong, but he did mention that subsequently during a podcast.
Maybe I'm misremembering.
Yeah.
So why was it so difficult to get debates going? Why? What do you have an idea? Like why? Because I found it very frustrating that the people who disagreed with us were very often willing to smear us publicly. They were willing to give criticism to us publicly, but would not engage with us publicly.
Well, if you don't have the scientific facts on your side, it's very difficult to debate somebody. So I fully understand that you don't want to do it. And if you can't argue with the science and public health using the principles of public health, then the only thing left is either to silence or censor or to slander. So I assume that was the reason, but it's probably done not very consciously, but maybe unconsciously from their perspective.
Okay, Martin. Now, on my list of things to talk about, we've finally come to the Great Barrington Declaration, which was October 2020. And I have to say to those who are listening, I'm never going to forget what happened. It was late September, and I was sitting I think maybe in this office right here, and I was just minding my own business, and you called me up and said, Jay, can you come to Massachusetts next week? It was during a lockdown. It was, it was very difficult to travel. But as soon as I heard that you were inviting me to a conference, and then you said, I think Sunetra Gupta is going to come. Of course, I had to say yes. How did that come about, Martin? How did you manage to arrange it? What was your idea of the Great Barrington Declaration, and how did of that conference that led to the Great Barrington Declaration? What were the circumstances of that?
So in August, I met Jay Bhattacharya, who worked at the American Institute of Economic Research in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. And when we were departing, he sort of told me, well, if you want to organize something, we can do it here. So that was a very generous suggestion. So I was thinking, well, what could we do? So I figured, well, one problem for journalists is that they don't get to speak really with the epidemiologists who know something about this. And it's not enough with like a 2-minute or 5-minute chat. It would be really good to have some journalists who might be interested in the pandemic to come and have in-depth discussions with epidemiologists. So I figured, let's invite some journalists and let's invite some epidemiologists. I tried a few local epidemiologists, but they couldn't make it. And I figured, well, I'll try you. I mean, California's pretty far away, but you said yes right on the fly. You didn't even consult with your family. So I was very excited that you would come. And then I figured we would do like a video thing with one of the journalists. And it would be nice to have Sunetra on that video link. But I should be polite and ask if she wants to come in person. So to my shock, she said, yes, she'll come in person. So that was great. So the purpose of the meeting was to sort of meet with journalists and discuss, and we had a little bit of that. There were not that many journalists there, but then I think all three of us were sort of thinking that maybe we should put together a one-page thing and put it out there. They had done something similar. Sunetra done something similar together with Carl Hennigan and Francois Ballou and others in the UK, writing an open letter to the government there. So I think we could do something similar in the US or internationally. So we hadn't written anything before we arrived there. So I think you came there before Sunetra. So you and I started to work on it, and then Sunetra came and she came on board to work on it, and eventually we had a document after 48 hours or whatever. And it was a one page, and it wasn't anything new or novel. It was just basic principles of public health applied to the pandemic. And then at that meeting was a guy named Lou Eastman, who is a genius when it comes to web pages. So he worked all night to put up a beautiful, wonderful web page, and where people could co-sign it. And we asked some of our colleagues to sign it. So like publicly, we had maybe 40 or so. And then we had we had an interview with Freddie Sawyer at Unheard of a video link from the UK. And he put that interview out there. And then we had later on also an interview with, I think, Laura Ingram, and a few other things. So this took off. I think not because anything genius that we said, but because we said that many people were thinking. And I think what had happened before, they were trying to pretend that there was a consensus. And if anybody like Scott spoke up, well, it was only one person and they didn't have the right credentials, so they wasn't from the right university or whatever. So the fact that there were three of us, you, me, and Sunetra, who we all worked on infectious diseases. We all came from reasonably respectable universities, Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford. And there were three of us instead of only one. So it became impossible to ignore it. And of course, there were a lot of attacks on it from politicians and from journalists and from other scientists, including from the NIH director Francis Collins, who called us fringe epidemiologists and asked for a takedown of it. But every time there was a piece in the newspapers who argued against it, they had a link to it. So I figured, yes, because people are smart, so they would maybe click on the link and then read the Great Barrington Declaration and realize that this is actually very solid science and very solid public health. So it took off, and I think eventually it reached over 900,000 signers, co-signers.
I had a very superstitious thing. I remember when Lou Eastman made the webpage, I said, was it to you? I don't remember if it was to you. I said, if 1 million people sign it, the lockdowns will be over. And we still are not quite at 1 million, but the lockdowns are gone, I think, at least for now.
No, I remember you said that, and I thought, you're crazy, that won't happen with you, but you were certainly much closer than my estimate. But it was pretty clear that, with some exceptions, we wouldn't really be able to convince the politicians or the journalists or the top scientists who were running the show. But people were living this lockdowns in their daily lives, and they may not have studied, have a PhD in immunology, but people are not stupid, so they will understand. They understand the basics of immunology and so on. So I figured what we could do is to reach the public, either directly or, I think in any case, indirectly. So somebody will read it, but then they will talk to their neighbors or friends without even mentioning the declaration. So I think it sort of spread through the grapevine like that. And I think it was very successful because more and more people were questioning the lockdowns. And then when people start questioning them, the politicians, they are very astute to what people think, so they're going to follow. And of course, the journalists wants to be read, so they're eventually going to follow also. But the leading scientists like Anthony Fauci or some of the university presidents who instituted lockdowns at universities and vaccine mandates for students, I think they're never gonna change. So they will, I think, stubbornly continue with their beliefs on the lockdowns.
I remember there was a very vicious set of attacks on us in the press, but the one that most shocked me was an attack on us in the British Medical Journal. Again, once upon a time, one of the top scientific medical journals in the world, and it was an attack essentially insinuating that we wrote the Great Barrington Declaration for money. That we were somehow funded by the Koch brothers, which is ironic because the Koch brothers actually did fund some pro-lockdown scientists. So of course it was a lie. Like I took no money from the Koch. I've never taken any money from the Koch brothers. Martin, have you ever taken any money from the Koch brothers?
No, I haven't. I mean, Harvard University received millions of dollars from the Koch brothers, but not for anything that I'm even closely affiliated with. So that was just a complete lie that somebody came up with. And it was that piece in the British Medical Journal was just like what you would expect to see in a really trashy gossip magazine.
Yeah, it was as if they didn't want to actually engage with the substance again. There was no even attempt at debate. It was just a job in order to discredit us in the minds of the public. Which I don't think worked. I think the main thing that we accomplished with the Great Barrington Declaration was that we told the public that there was a debate among scientists. That was, I think, tremendously important for the public to know that there wasn't a consensus. And I think that people like Francis Collins, who wrote that email, that very infamous email calling me, you, and Sunetra fringe epidemiologists, he abused his position. I think many scientists stayed silent because they were afraid that people like Francis Collins would destroy their careers if they opposed him.
I mean, NIH, he's the head of NIH, which is the biggest funder of medical research in the world by far. And Anthony Fauci is the head of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases, which is part of NIH and which is the biggest chunk of research money for infectious diseases. So, of course, you take a huge risk for you professionally and personally and for your family by opposing them. So, yeah, I mean, they did abuse their power. And what they should have done is they should have organized the discussions. They should have said, okay, we have different views here. Let's have a discussion and we organize a debate about these things.
There were people at Harvard that signed it, even on the front page of the Great Barrington Declaration. Were people at Harvard reaching out to you about it, including must have been the people that signed it must have reached out to you, I imagine.
Yes. So there were many people from Harvard who signed it. I received many emails from people at Harvard, including people I never knew. Very encouraging emails. Some people went public with the support, others kept it private, which I respect and fully understand. But yeah, I mean, one of the former chairs of the Department of Epidemiology at Harvard signed the Great Barrington Declaration. So this used to be mainstream use in public health, and then, and I would say still a majority of public health people would support it, but they couldn't really voice their views. And if you look at CDC and the state health departments, there are even more limitations because they can't contradict the official policy because they are sort of state employees or city employees or federal employees.
The people at Harvard that signed it, I greatly respect, of course. But it was an act of bravery to sign it, Martin. It's interesting that you got emails from people who signed it or supported it without wanting to become public about it. I also got emails like that from people at Stanford, and what was clear from those emails was that that there were many people who agreed with the basic principles of public health, but B, to say that out loud at a place like Stanford or Harvard was a transgressive act. That they feared for their careers if they were to actually publicly sign on and declare their support for a document like the Great Barrington Declaration.
Yeah, and I think the fear was very much warranted.
Okay, so let's move forward in time a little bit. The vaccine comes out in December of 2020. The vaccine trial, it looked good in some ways. 40,000 people were for the mRNA trials, 95% protection against symptomatic disease. As a statistician, what was your analysis of the trial at the time?
Well, first of all, I was impressed that it was so quickly. The development of the vaccine came so quickly. But I mean, the good thing was it was randomized, because that's the basic principles of any approval of any drug or vaccine, that we want to have a randomized trial so that we can compare the vaccine with a placebo or something else that to make sure that it actually works. So if we have a cancer drug, for example, we compare the cancer drug either to a placebo or to some older drug. And the purpose is to show that if you get this new drug, that you don't die as much, because that's the purpose of these cancer drugs, to keep people alive. So this is so the fact that there were randomized trials was a good thing, but they were not well designed, because they showed that they reduced that the vaccine efficacy was 95% for symptomatic disease. But I don't want to seem heartless here, but to be honest, I don't really care if somebody gets to spend 3 days in bed, they miss on work, and they feel miserable for a few days. That's not what I care about. I care about people not dying, and to some extent also not being hospitalized. That's what's important here. But they want the science to look at that. So most of the people who were enrolled in these trials were either young or middle-aged adults. And they won't die from COVID because of the low risk. They won't die whether they are vaccinated or not. So there were very few people dead in the vaccinated group, but there was also very few people who died in the control group, in the placebo group. So the randomized trials did not tell us whether they reduce mortality or not. So they were approved based on the hope that if you reduce symptomatic disease, you will also reduce mortality. And that's not an unreasonable thing to assume, but they should have been designed so that one can look at mortality as outcome. And I mean, one way to do that is just to increase the sample size, but that wasn't practical because they would have taken too long time. So the way it should have done it is to enroll mostly older people, because then you will get mortality, COVID mortality in the placebo group, and then you'll see, well, is there less in the vaccinated group? So they were badly designed, these trials.
One hole I thought in the trial, I noticed almost immediately on reading it, was that they didn't look at outcomes for people who had previously been infected with COVID and recovered. To me, it seemed pretty clear, at least from the biological literature, that that there was already good protection against reinfection and severe disease on reinfection if you'd already recovered from COVID. And of course, a substantial number of people by December of 2020 had already had COVID and recovered. And so a real important question the trial might have answered but didn't is how necessary was the vaccine for that group, the set of people who already had COVID and recovered?
So there were a few people in the trials that had COVID, but they removed them from the main analysis. I think actually that's correct to do that because, as you said, we knew that if you had COVID, you already had protection. So it's not very, it sort of contaminates the analysis if you include them because they are protected whether they get in the placebo group or in the vaccine group. So I think it was the right decision to remove those from the main analysis and focus on to see if the vaccines are helpful for those who haven't had COVID, because that's really what we want to know. We already knew that if you've had COVID, you had good protection because there were very few serious reinfections. Immunity doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get it again, but it means that the next time you have immunity, enough immunity that you won't be seriously ill. So I think that was the right decision with the design. What was the wrong decision was then to say that even if you had COVID, you need to get vaccinated. That was astonishing. And as I said before, both unscientific and unethical.
Certainly nothing in the trial would support that. The trial, as you said, removed the people that had already had.
Now, there's this Danish research group, I think it's probably the best vaccine research group in the world, led by, they wrote this paper led by Dr. Christine Stable-Ben. Since the individual trials was not big enough to look at mortality, they decided, let's pool the trials. So let's pool the mRNA trials, Pfizer, Moderna, and see what's their effect on mortality. And then we pooled adenovirus virus vaccines, which is AstraZeneca, J&J, and Sputnik. So we put those together and see if they reduce mortality. And they had to go through very difficult sort of forensic work to get all the data from all mortality from these trials. But they found that mRNA vaccines did not reduce short-term mortality in this population of young and middle-aged people, while the adenovirus vector vaccines, such as AstraZeneca and J&J, they did reduce mortality in this population by at least 30%. That was the upper confidence interval. So probably more, but at least by 30%. So, I mean, they did a heroic effort to try to sort of do whatever could be done from these randomized trials. But, of course, they can't. We still don't have any evidence from the older people who are more likely to benefit from the vaccines. And I think there are observational studies from Sweden, for example, by Nordström and others that show that older people had reduction in hospitalizations and death from these vaccines during that spring of 2021. But we don't have randomized data on that. We should have had. So I think the Danish scientists, they do a heroic effort to do this. But also the trials, they stopped early. Once and they shouldn't have. They should have gone on with the trials to look at long-term efficacy and long-term adverse reactions. And the argument was that, well, now when we know that vaccines work, we have to give people in the control groups the vaccines. But I think maybe you can make the argument for older people, but you shouldn't be making for younger people because there were a lot of older people who needed it more than the control people in the trial. So I think that was also highly unethical and unscientific to end the trials, those randomized trials so early.
Now, the trials had tens of thousands of people, which sounds like a big number, but the vaccines are about to be recommended to almost every person on the face of the earth, including up to children as young as 6 months old. A lot of people have different kinds of immune conditions and other conditions. How would you be able to tell from the trial if people with rare conditions would benefit or not benefit from the vaccines. Is it possible?
No, it's not possible. And it's not possible to design a study that will find all those details. Just like you cannot design a study that will find all rare adverse reactions. So that's why we have to monitor these vaccines after they've been approved.
Okay, so that's the trial. Now you're still involved with the CDC in their vaccine safety data link project to track and one of the projects that come up obviously is that once the vaccine is starting to be rolled out to the population at large, what is the evidence of side effects? And I remember very distinctly in April of 2021, the CDC announced that they had found a signal of elevated risk of clotting disorders in, I think it was like middle-aged women who were using or had used the J&J vaccine, the one-shot adenovirus vector vaccine. No signal reported for the other mRNA vaccines. And the CDC decided to pause the rollout of the vaccine then. Martin, what was your reaction to that? And I remember you wrote an op-ed. Tell us about that. What happened with that?
So this blood clotting was found in young women.
Young women, okay.
They were all under age 50. I think there was one man also. I don't remember exactly the gender proportions, but it was more women. And so that's reasonable to pause it for young people or for young women. But these vaccines are most important for older people because they're highest risk for COVID. So we're back to this differential risk. And this is a one-dose vaccine that was important, especially for hard-to-reach people, like maybe in rural areas, so homeless people who is hard to reach with 2 doses. So it's very important for vulnerable people. So I thought it was not appropriate to pass this vaccine for older people. And I decided so I was involved in the discussions of this matter because I was serving on the COVID vaccine adverse event working group.
For the CDC.
There was a working group under the CDC working group to help ACIP, which is the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices that advises CDC on what vaccines to recommend. So I wrote an op-ed in the Hill arguing that we should not have this pause for this vaccine on older people because there was a shortage at the time of vaccines. And older people needed this vaccine, and many people hadn't gotten it yet. So I guess they were not taken kindly by CDC, so they fired me from that working group when I published that. And obviously, I was arguing for vaccine. So I'm probably the only person who's been fired by CDC for being too pro-vaccine. They just didn't want any conflicting views. So,
I mean, it is a remarkable thing to have a CDC advisor arguing with the statistical background you have, arguing and the public health background you have, arguing that the vaccine rollout ought not be paused. That instead you could make a recommendation about young people versus versus old people, take into account the risk profiles. Seemed completely reasonable, but the CDC's response to that was to fire you.
Yeah. No, they did have another response also because 4 days after my op-ed, they lifted the pause.
Of course they did, Martin. I do think like that was a remarkable, maybe even a watershed event in the history of the pandemic, because very shortly after that incident, the uptake of the vaccine, which had been pretty widely adopted by most of the population, people stopped uptaking the vaccine. The uptake curve sort of trended downward. The pause actually killed the enthusiasm for not just the J&J vaccine, but for the other vaccines as well.
Yeah, so with the pause, the uptake of the J&J, of course, dropped, but it never recovered.
Yeah.
So that even though the pause was lifted, it basically killed that vaccine. And based on the Danish study, that might have been the better vaccine.
Yeah.
Of the three that was approved in the US.
Okay, now this is a hard topic, I know, for you to talk about. It's hard topic for me to think about. You got COVID in 2021. I think it was early 2021. And could you describe your first of all, I think it's important to know something about your personal medical history. You have a condition that makes you susceptible to, basically an immune condition that makes you very, very susceptible to respiratory infections and severe reactions on them.
Yeah, so I mean, I knew I was going to get COVID sooner or later, so that wasn't a surprise. And of course, everybody, or almost everybody now, has had COVID. I have a genetic disorder which is called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, which makes me highly sensitive to infections. So ever since I was a child, when other people get a cold, I get I get bedridden for a couple of weeks or bronchitis and stuff. So I've always had a hard time with infections. So I figured that, well, I will get COVID at some point, and when I do, it's probably going to be much more serious than the typical person my age. It wouldn't be as bad as somebody who is 80 or 90 years old, probably, but so I sort of expected that, and that's exactly what happened. So I had COVID before the vaccine had just been approved, but I wasn't eligible yet. So I got it before I had any chance to get vaccinated. And yes, I was I had COVID, and then I had pneumonia, and then was hospitalized for pulmonary embolism. So I was sick for a long time, and I think that was quite serious. So I went to the local hospital here in Connecticut, Manchester Hospital, and I think they saved my life there. So I'm very appreciative of what they did.
Well, I remember that time vividly, Martin, because I mean, by then we had been through fire together. I mean, we had been at the White House. We'd written the Great Barrington Declaration. We'd suffered through all of the craziness of the smears, and we'd written op-ed after op-ed. We were talking to each other daily, and when you got sick, it was very scary for me. I mean, it was sometimes I get accused, and you get accused of being COVID deniers. That nothing could be further from the truth. I'd seen how difficult. I mean, I have two older relatives who died of COVID. So it was a very serious condition for certain people, and I knew about your alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency condition, and that it predisposed you to serious outcomes from respiratory conditions. So I also was quite, I didn't know what would happen if you did get COVID, and from my point of view, from the outside, I was frustrated that I was 3,000 miles away and I couldn't do more to help you while you were suffering through this, and you really did almost die from it.
Well, a funny thing there is that when I was released from the hospital, I got a little bag with presents, and there was a little ceremony with the hospital director because I was the patient number 500 that they had released. The number 500, COVID patient number 500 that they had sort of released after treating the COVID. So that was kind of a nice little thing.
But it was a huge relief, an answered prayer in my book that you survived that. The reason I bring this story up, Martin, I think it's important for the audience to know, is because shortly after that, Harvard started requiring all its employees to get faculty even to get the COVID vaccine. What was your reaction to that? I mean, you now already had been through COVID, had recovered. You had natural immunity after COVID recovery. The scientific evidence very clearly didn't address that, as we talked about it a little earlier. You have this rare condition that in fact, the scientific evidence on the trials and the vaccines meant that there was no evidence there for your specific condition, whether the vaccine was wise or not. So the state of the scientific evidence was, I don't know that the vaccine is particularly effective for you or needed for you. And you already had COVID, been through fire, and you'd recovered from it. and now your employer is requiring you to get the COVID vaccine?
Well, I believe in science, and so I knew that I had immunity from having had COVID, so I knew I didn't need the vaccine. So there was no reason for me to take the vaccine. There was no reason. I wasn't putting anybody else in danger, because we know from studies, there was one study in Israel, I think the first one, who showed that infection-acquired immunity is stronger than vaccine-acquired immunity, which is exactly what you would expect. It would have been a shock if it wasn't. But they showed it sort of hard facts, and there were other studies then later who showed the same things. So it was very clear that I didn't need it, neither for myself nor to protect others. I didn't see any patients because I'm not a physician. I'm a PhD ethnologist and statistician. So there was sort of unscientific to require me to get the vaccine, and it would also be unethical, because I do think that these vaccines do save older people who haven't had the vaccine. And my 87-year-old neighbor, for example, hadn't had the vaccine yet. So why should I take it if I don't need it before she gets it? And not just in the United States, because there was a worldwide shortage. So there were people in India, Nigeria, Brazil, many other countries who hadn't gotten it yet and who needed this to protect them. So I think it was unethical for me to take the vaccine also, since I didn't need it. And then third things, because of my immune disorder, who knows what that means? There was no information on it, so that's a big guess. So I knew I didn't need it, but I didn't know what the potential harms were. So I think that vaccine mandates shouldn't be there for other reasons also. I think having vaccine mandates will kill trust in vaccines, and it's actually what happened. We need to, but the individual freedom is not the only reason to be against these vaccine mandates. There are very strong public health reasons for it. Yeah. So I decided I would not take the vaccine, and I was fired because of that.
Did you ask for an exemption from Harvard?
I asked for a medical exemption based on my alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. That was not granted. They did grant a number of exemptions to faculty members, but I did not get one. I also asked for a religious exemption, but that was maybe it was partly serious and partly less serious, I guess.
Well, the point is that you had good medical reasons, and you had personal reasons, and you were posing a danger to basically nobody. You weren't seeing patients. You weren't even. I mean, Harvard wasn't holding classes in person, so you weren't even around students really. So there was no epidemiological or public health reason to give you the vaccine. And you asked, and you're a faculty in good standing for decades. And Harvard decided that they weren't going to allow you to, as an expert, you could say it's not necessary. As a Harvard faculty member, they could treat you with respect and try to account for your knowledge and your particular health condition. But they decided to ignore all of that and fire you over of not taking the vaccine.
Yeah, so technically it was. Faculty members at Harvard Medical School works for one of the Harvard affiliated hospitals, almost everybody. So I work for Mass General, Brigham Mass General, or Mass General Brigham Hospital system. So technically they made a decision, and then Harvard University has sort of ended my faculty appointment as a consequence of that.
And now you had tenure. The tenure didn't protect you.
So Harvard call it appointment of indefinite duration. That's what they call it.
Okay, I mean it's hard. You can look at it and just take it at face value. It's a vaccine. They didn't allow you to stay on because of the vaccines. But it strikes me as if you had been in on the other side of the debate and you were asked for some kind of exemption to a policy that was so obviously irrational that maybe they would have given you some kind of special. I mean, you were, as I said, a faculty in good standing, had a tremendous career, impacting public health positively. And Harvard. It's still shocking to me, but Harvard did nothing to try to accommodate you at all, to try to protect you from having to take this vaccine when it didn't make sense for you to take it.
Yeah, they could have made some accommodations, but they did not. And I think it's problematic for Harvard because people know that there is immunity when you've been infected. And it reflects very badly on the scientific credentials of the university when they sort of go so against basic scientific knowledge of infection-acquired immunity or natural immunity. So it's very surprising, and I think the university's reputation takes a hit because of this. And I mean, I wasn't the only one being fired. I had written an article earlier about that hospitals should hire rather than fire nurses who had natural immunity. So we had not just at Brigham and Mass General, but at many other places, there were nurses who spent 2020 taking care of COVID patients. Many of them got infected. They would stay home for a while, and then they got well, and now they have great immunity from having had COVID. And they continue to take care of COVID patients. And then suddenly some bureaucrat decides that, no, you can't work here anymore because you don't have been vaccinated. So first they put them, exposing them to COVID, and then they won't even count the infection-acquired immunity, which is much stronger than vaccine immunity. So that's... again, unscientific, unethical, and just plain mean. So I think that all hospitals and all universities should immediately rehire everybody who was fired for not taking the vaccine.
I mean, I agree with that entirely, Martin. So I kept you longer than I promised I'd keep you, but I want to end this with a couple of questions. First, can you give me an assessment of how Harvard did during the pandemic? I think it was terrible that they fired you. I agree with you; it was unscientific. But it seems to me that they, as one of the top universities in the world, they had an obligation, not just to not fire you, but on a positive way to actually encourage debates and discussions. How did they do holistically during the pandemic? Were they forced for good? How did they do relative to other universities? What is your assessment of Harvard? And you can please definitely take into account the direct way they treated you.
No, if we ignore my personal situation, I think that Harvard did poorly. Any university should encourage debate and discussions, and they didn't. Harvard was one of the first places to close the universities, and that led to other universities were following Harvard's lead and giving other coverage to do the same thing and close universities, which I think was wrong, and closing schools. So Harvard was the leading place for the school closures in that sense. And then the denial of infection-acquired immunity is sort of astonishing.
Yeah.
At the same time, there were many faculty members at Harvard who got it right. Some were more outspoken than others. But there were very many who were outspoken. This one was one assistant professor who works with autism, and she saw the tremendous sort of collateral damage on her patient groups, because suddenly these autism children didn't get the services they needed, and how they regressed. So she saw the negative consequences of the collateral public health damage firsthand, and she was one of the signers of the Great Barrington Declaration, Dr. Sylvia Fogel, and there were others also who spoke up in different manners.
That's what I saw from the outside, that there were a number of excellent scientists and excellent doctors, some of whom took big risks to speak up. But it still surprised me that a place like Harvard, it required risk and courage to take a risk, that it required courage to speak up against the lockdowns, against some of the vaccine mandates and policies that happened. That same could be true, of course, of Stanford and many, many other universities. The kind of environment that I would expect from a place like Harvard would be, it's just a matter of course that there would be people that would speak up, and that Harvard as an institution would protect them rather than make them feel like as if they're at risk from doing so.
Yeah, and academic freedom requires one thing is that people are not fired or canceled for what they say or for the research they do. So that's one half of it. But the other half is not to have bullying. Because if you have bullying or slander, then people will not dare to speak up and they will self-censor. So, and there was definitely, I was slandered by a couple of other Harvard people. So that should not be tolerated. That should not be accepted. And I in all my debates, I've tried to be polite, very forceful with the scientific arguments, but never sort of go outside of that and make it personal.
Yeah. Okay, Martin, last question, and I'll let you go. And maybe this is the hardest question. What are you doing next for to stay engaged with the debate? I mean, of course, you still have your Twitter account now. You don't just have 400 people; you have hundreds of thousands of people. What should be next for you, and what should be next for public health?
Well, I think we've been proven right when it comes to the lockdowns and the vaccine mandates and those things. So that debate is to some extent over. We don't have lockdowns anymore, and I don't think they can reinstitute them. But there are bigger problems that has to be dealt with. And one is the whole thing of how the academic community operates. It failed. And I mean, there were many heroic individuals, and many rank and file scientists was just doing their regular research because they don't work with public health. But the scientific leadership failed, and the way that sort of Sunetta Gupta at Oxford has explained it is there's sort of a cartel system, not one cartel for all of science, but in each subfield there's a cartel system where there's a leadership sort of who controls both the funding and the publication process. And we saw during the pandemic actually that sort of the scientific powerhouse like the US and UK was not where the most interesting things were coming up. So the interesting things about infection-acquired immunity, about how long the vaccine protection lasted, and so things came from, or if mask works or not, came from countries who are sort of on the periphery, small countries with good quality science, but who are a little bit on the periphery so that they have their own funding streams, like Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Israel, and Qatar, all sort of produce some of the key papers. So we saw that during the pandemic. So I think we have to decentralize science, both in terms of the funding, in terms of the publications, and we have to sort of reform how the scientific community operates, because otherwise we already lost trust, people's trust in the scientific community has already lost the public's trust to a large extent. That's the responsibility of that. For that is a small group of leaders, science leaders. But the responsibility to fix it, I think, has to involve all scientists, including rank and file scientists. So we have to reform how science operates so that we can regain the trust of the public, because science is important for our societal well-being and for civilization. And if we can't have an honest search for truth in science, I would be very pessimistic about the future of society as a whole.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I'm most excited about is my work with you and with Scott Atlas on this Academy of Science and Freedom. I mean, that's one of the missions of it, and I think through that kind of organization, we have to advocate for reform of scientific. I mean, I think I agree with you. The scientific community as a whole, especially the leadership of it, performed very, very poorly. They created an environment where doing normal science, doing just regular public health, advocating for standard public health measures became an act of courage rather than something that would be done as a matter of course. And that means that the scientific community desperately needs reform. And I also agree with you that it's vital for the future of our society, all the whole world society, that science functions properly. So, Martin, I should say one last thing before I let you go. What you've been through has been terrible. What I think a lot of scientists that spoke up have been through has been terrible. But there's been one bright spot for me personally, which is that thanks to all of this, I now have a Swedish brother in Connecticut, and I'm grateful at least for that. So many great people I've got to meet through the pandemic. Are there any bright spots you can point to?
Well, I have a Bengali brother in California and a Bengali sister in England, so that's great. Well, I think that the choice for me was to pick between science and my academic career, and I picked science, and I think that was the correct thing to do. That's the only choice, I think. So, and I have met a lot of people who are very intellectually stimulating people to interact with, who also are the highest characters. So that has been great. So I don't have any regrets of anything I did of choosing my path here. So and I honestly hope that Harvard can get its act together at some point. It probably will take some time, but I hope they will, as well as other universities.
Well, thank you, Martin, for giving me an hour and a half of your time. And then thank you for telling the story that you went through. So I mean, I know sometimes it's hard for you to talk about your own personal things, but the scientific arguments you've made have been crystal clear through the pandemic. And I wish that they had been followed more closely by public health than they had. So until next time, this is Professor Jay Bhattacharya for the Illusion of Consensus podcast.
Has the dust settled from the COVID policy response? Far from it. The storms are many. Inflation, learning losses, ill health, high crime, broken government services, displaced workers, substance abuse, mass loneliness, discredited science, real estate crisis, censorship, and overweening state power. The world is on fire with war, mass killings, crime, hunger, revolution. The lack of accountability, or even so much as an apology, is a foreshadowing. They'll keep their newfound powers and try it all again. Brownstone Institute is seeking answers, undertaking important research and publishing the results while providing fellowships for dissident scholars who have been professionally displaced. It's not about this one crisis. We urgently need to restore peace, prosperity, and integrity in science and journalism. Visit brownstone.org for more. We may never get to the truth, but we can get closer to the truth. There will be no stopping the efforts.